apply to the spokesman for the Scottish National Party, Mhairi Black.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to rise to say that the SNP will be fully supporting Labour's motion today, and I want to thank the member for Salford and Eccles for making the case so eloquently. I think it's worthwhile to remember or to reiterate a couple of key points. So HMRC gave this contract to Concentrix with the additional capacity to review and correct tax credit claims that are potentially based on incorrect information. Now, one of the main tasks of Concentrix was to find people with undisclosed partners, so to see if people were claiming the benefit as a single person but were actually living with others. And this is where the problem really begins, because Concentrix spent a considerable amount of money putting out phishing-style letters to try and catch people out claiming fraudulently. In a written answer on the 7th of September, the Treasury Minister said that Concentrix sent out 381,000 letters to tax credit claimants requesting proof of single status, 254,000 letters asking for details of hours worked, 312,000 letters asking for evidence of childcare use. Now, Concentrix logic was that unless people replied with the appropriate evidence, their tax credits would be stopped. However, despite all these letters apparently being sent out, thousands of people had absolutely no idea that they were being investigated. Quite often, they didn't know that they were under investigation or that their tax credits had been stopped until they did receive a letter. Yes,
Thank you for the Honourable Lady for giving way. Would the Honourable Lady agree with me that, given the clampdown on supposed fraudulent claims with these phishing letters, that wouldn't it be good to see the same rigour applied to aggressive corporate tax avoidance?
Yeah, absolutely.
Entirely, and it's something I'll touch on later. But once we began... Oh, on you go.
Would you also accept, however, that Concentrix, although they had over 1.5 million cases referred to them, they whittled them down to less than a fifth of the cases which were sent by HMRC. So had it been in HMRC's control, then a lot more people may have been affected than were actually affected.
I think that one of the other interesting points is that when we looked into this with the Work and Pensions Committee, we discovered that Concentrix actually had subcontractors. I believe it was 3, but they weren't allowed to go into detail about who or what their methods were or whatever. So I think that's something that the government should be hopefully answering at some point. We're going to make a wee bit of progress. But once we started to dig into this issue, because all of my constituents that I dealt with, like many other members here, didn't discover that their tax credits had stopped until they went to collect them from the bank and discovered that there was nothing. So once we started to look into this, it's truly the most ridiculous level of incompetence that I've ever heard. People were accused of being in relationships with dead tenants 70 years their senior. They were accused of being in relationships with some of their own children. In my constituency, Scottish flat numbers seem to be a major cause of issue for Concentrix, because they couldn't get their head around the fact that flat 1-1 and 1-2 were across the landing from each other and they weren't the same house. But the best one, though, has to be the case of R.S. McCall. And just to give you a bit of perspective, R.S. McCall is a corner shop in Scotland that is as common as a W.H. Smith is in England. And yet people were being accused of living with this mysterious Mr. McCall because their flat was above an R.S. McCall shop. And at no point did anyone in Concentrix or HMRC think, wait a minute, this Casanova's getting about a bit. At no point. Now, this would almost be very funny. This would be funny until you remember that this is actually people's lives. This is their survival that we're talking about. Now, I was part of the evidence session, as I mentioned, where we heard from claimants who had their tax credit stopped. And this is where we have to remember the human cost of this. First, we heard from a woman called Mhairi, who was a mother of 2. She had 6 weeks with no support, didn't discover that her benefits had stopped until she went to the bank. She said that she genuinely could not fill the cupboards with any food, and she spoke of the shame of having to take her kids to a food bank to be able to rely on the charity of others to be able to eat. This was followed on by a woman called Sarah, who had no hand. She suffered chronic pain every day of her life. She had 2 young kids. I believe they were both under the age of 5. And she spent a combined total of 19 hours on the phone waiting for someone to Concentrix to answer. When she finally did get through to somebody, the person at the other end of the phone just kept saying, "Oh, I don't know, sorry about that, no, you're going to need to phone back and see if you get somebody else." She was asked to write a letter, and she explained that she couldn't write due to her disability, only to be told, "Well, sorry, you'll just need to find someone else to write it." Now, at this point, this woman broke down in tears in front of the committee. She genuinely got so overwhelmed with emotion when she spoke of the fact that she had to look at her kids knowing that she didn't know where the next meal was coming from. Yes.
Thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. Does she share my frustration at my constituent who was down to her last £5 and was told to send documents to Concentrix by recorded delivery and had to make the decision about whether she fed her child or indeed sent those documents? I'm sure she'll agree with me that this is absolutely horrific.
Yes, no, it's actually completely disgusting for this to be happening under the watch of government. But I think that it's worthwhile also remembering that when we talk about these individual horrendous cases, these aren't unfortunate examples or rare examples. This is happening throughout the UK. And I have to say, whoever made the music that gets played when you're put on hold at Concentrix must be making a fortune, because my whole office can whistle it off the top of their heads because we were kept on hold so long, and that was when we were on the MP's hotline. So the very fact that you've got people who don't have access to the MP's hotline having to sit on the phone for up to 90 minutes sometimes is absolutely ridiculous. I'll give way to yourself.
I wonder whether other colleagues had the experience that my staff had, which is that Concentric just flatly refused to deal with them and said that it would have to be that it was the MP they would speak to. Now, obviously, we're only there one day a week, and that might be the time when it's not easy to take the history from the constituent.
Yes, no, entirely. And it's also worth remembering that this number that people were being asked to phone was an 0845 number, so it cost an absolute fortune. And I think anybody in this room would find it cost a fortune. So imagine just how much of a pressure that's going to put on somebody who not only qualifies for tax credits already, but is now being told that they're not even getting the tax credits. I'm going to make a bit of progress. Thanks. But finally, when we, as an MP's office, did get through to people, we were told that they had to apply for mandatory reconsiderations, only to discover that the contract also delegated extensive decision-making power to Concentrix, including the processing of mandatory reconsiderations. So this private company has to investigate itself to find out if it made the correct decision, and bearing in mind that this contract states that they should only be paid on the basis of results. So this entire contract has been a shambles and ludicrous from the very start. And as if all this wasn't bad enough, during that evidence session with the committee, Concentrix admitted that 90 to 95% of all mandatory reconsiderations were upheld. 95% were upheld. This company was openly admitting that they only got it right 5% of the time. And this is with the people who have applied for an appeal. How many people have had their benefits stolen from them who haven't went for a mandatory reconsideration? Yes, when you go.
I just think it is worth, the Honourable Lady is very kind to let me, it is worth just saying that often the reason the mandatory reconsideration succeeds is because the information previously requested is supplied to that timetable. And it isn't fair to say it's because it was always wrong. It is sometimes because the information requested is at that point being supplied, and then the correct claim can be instated.
I appreciate the point that the Minister's making, but it's also, you have to remember that HMRC and the government were supplying information to Concentrix, so a lot of the fault is on this government.
Absolutely. And on government responsibility. I was talking earlier about government responsibility before Mr Speaker quite rightly encouraged my pithiness, but for the UK government to take proper responsibility, does my honourable friend agree, the only way that can happen is not only substantial and appropriate compensation, but for full apologies to be given to those constituents who are wrongly dealt with by Concentrix and this government.
Couldn't agree more. But I think that it's also worth exploring the fact that where Concentrix were saying that 95% of mandatory reconsiderations were upheld, in the next panel that we got, where we had the Chief Exec from HMRC, he said that no, it wasn't as bad as 95%, it was 73% were upheld. And he said this as though this was some kind of poverty. I'm going to make some progress, thanks. But this is such a farce between government and Concentrix that they can't even agree on how many times they got it wrong. I mean, this is just a ridiculous situation to find ourselves in. And meanwhile, there are people having to go to food banks to then come home to their child crying because they don't want Tesco's 80p bolognese for the 4th time that week. Now, the truth is that I appreciate that mistakes can happen in all walks of life, no matter what job that you're in, mistakes can happen. But the reality is that when mistakes are made by government, it's people who suffer, and it's quite often the most vulnerable people. So whilst we support Labour's motion wholeheartedly, we have to highlight that the government has to bear some of the blame for this. The contract itself states that HMRC is required to monitor the exercise and remains responsible in the law for the actions carried out by the contractor. I don't believe this government has done that adequately. And the most damning thing of this entire saga is that Concentrix were under the impression that their contract was going to be renewed. It was only after the media cottoned on to this and began writing about it. It was only after, I think there was 670 odd formal complaints put in by elected members to HMRC that the heat began to be turned up and this began to be taken seriously. Now, the Vice President of Concentrix said that he was initially only given 15 minutes notice before he went on a flight that the contract wasn't being renewed, and he pleaded with HMRC to be given an hour in order to inform staff.
Shocking.
An hour was the difference between this company thinking that they had a contract and that it was going to be renewed and it being taken away because of their shambolic work.
Shocking.
An hour's difference. The level of incompetence is truly incredible, and we cannot ignore that and place all the blame on Concentrix. So what needs to be done now? I think that in the first instance, the honourable member, who's not in his place anymore, raised the fact of this £100 hardship being given to people. But in all of my cases, that my constituents have been told that that £100 is going to be taken back off their benefits. So I think this is something that really has to be looked at, because if it's something that we're all being told at the same time, then it's clearly an issue. But to deal with this particular problem, the buck has to stop with HMRC. We have to now legislate so that this is never allowed to happen again. I think the government has to bring this kind of thing back in-house, because it's got to be back into the day-to-day responsibility of government. You can't say to a private company, we want you to make £1 billion worth of cuts, but we're only going to pay you on a results basis. That is a recipe for disaster, and it's the kind of thing that we just cannot allow to happen again. Now, one of the main reasons that this situation has occurred in the first place is because of a lack of resource and because departments aren't coping. So the Treasury must reconsider this ongoing policy of downsizing HMRC, especially when we're in the midst of such a cataclysmic problem that has happened here. And as my good friend, the member for Lanark and Hamilton Easton, has, as many people have made the point during this debate so far, the government needs to apologise to people. There is no shame in apologising and admitting that you got it wrong. You have to regain a bit of trust from the people who have been hurt through this. Concentrix is by no means innocent in any of this, but ultimately it was HMRC that signed the contract. It happened under your watch. Lastly, I know that the benches opposite will probably roll their eyes at this and probably stop listening when I say this, but the biggest problem that I have with issues like this is that this government seems to be perpetuating this overarching culture of blaming the poor. We always treat people with suspicion before anything. The onus is always on the individual to prove that they're not a thief, that they're not a fraud. The pressure is put on them, on people who are, quite frankly, have enough to deal with already. And I mean, I've stood in many of these debates, and I've heard that all these different groups, whether it be disabled people, pensioners, whether it be those on low wages, we target them all the time, and we end up that we pit these people against each other. We try and tell young people, oh, you can't get a job because pensioners are living too long. We tell the disabled that, sorry, but we can't afford your benefits anymore, we have to cut £30 off your benefits. And all the while, in the heart of all this, there is a small group of people who are wealthier than ever before. And I have to say, I include every elected member in this chamber in that category. We all got an 11% pay rise. Who else did? Who else has seen that kind of rise in the outside world? I mean, one of the other, I'm going to finish soon, but one of the other, a couple of weeks ago, in front of the Working Pensions Committee, we had Philip Green, who was giving evidence. Now, this is a guy who has lost £570 million worth of pensions, 22,000 pensioners affected, 11,000 jobs gone, and yet he's still able to go away on his £100 million yacht to the Greek islands. This isn't the kind of society that I think many of us want to be seeing. And let's not forget that despite this whole saga and despite all the horrendous things that we're hearing and all the stories, Concentrix are still going to walk away with millions of pounds from the work that they've already done. I believe the last figure was 27 million, I think. Now, this is a culture that the government has to be responsible for. 0.8% of benefits are fraudulently claimed. And yet the general public seems to think that a third of all benefits are fraudulently claimed. The government has a responsibility not just to look after people, but it has a responsibility for the language it uses, for the rhetoric and for the culture that it sets. Now, I know that me standing here probably won't convince the opposition benches of this, and this may be a little bit unconventional, Madam Deputy Speaker, but I want to urge them to go and see a film. It's called I, Daniel Blake, and it will give you a cold and sobering view of the reality that so many people are living. Because that film actually quite rightly points out that when we have debates like this, we're not talking about service users, we're not talking about claimants, we're not talking about numbers or national insurance numbers on a Concentrix computer screen. We're talking about citizens, your citizens, we're talking about people here, and they deserve to be treated with a lot more dignity and respect than they are. In her first statement as Prime Minister in Downing Street, Theresa May promised, if you're from an ordinary working class family, life is much harder than many people in Westminster realise. When we take the big calls, we'll think not of the powerful, but of you. When we pass new laws, we'll listen not to the mighty, but to you. When it comes to taxes, we'll prioritise not the wealthy, but you. So my last question to the government is when? There are people with absolutely nothing. When are you going to prioritise the people that need you most? Because Lord knows they are losing both patience and hope.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you.